Museums employ a lot of people the public never sees, like the people who are hanging paintings, or who are designing lighting, or maybe packing art into crates. Did you realize, though, that museums also employ detectives? That's right. A specialist in provenance tracks down the history of ownership of each object that a museum has. And at the Nelson-Atkins, we have more than 42,000 objects. So provenance specialist MacKenzie Mallon is kept very busy, tracing the lineage of each one of those objects. She uncovers amazing stories all the time, and she's joining us today to tell us some of those stories. Welcome to Art Bites, a podcast from the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art, where we take you beyond just the art on the walls and into the stories of the artists and the ideas behind them. I'm your host, Kathleen Layton. Thanks for speaking with us today, MacKenzie.
Thank you for having me.
You have one of my favorite jobs in the museum, so I'm really excited to talk to you today. First of all, let's talk about what provenance is, because I know from chatting with people, they sometimes don't even know what that field is all about. So tell us what it is.
Sure. Provenance is the ownership history of a work of art. So who owned a piece of art, when they owned it, where they were when they owned it, and how it changed hands from one owner to the next. So when we research the provenance of a work of art, we're looking to find where it's been, its path of ownership from the moment that it was created all the way down to the present day. And of course, like you said, we have so many objects here, and they come from such a wealth of different time periods and geographical areas and cultures. And there's a lot to discover about the history of all of our objects.
It sounds like it's really painstaking work. That's a lot. Something that was created hundreds of years ago, and you are tracing the entire lineage.
Well, we try. Of course, an object that's older is going to have a longer provenance, and in most instances, we're not going to be able to know the full history of most of the works that we research, just because records have been destroyed or lost over time, but we do our due diligence to uncover as much information as we can.
Do all museums have a provenance specialist?
No, all museums do provenance research. It's something that's been a part of standard curatorial practice really as long as museums have existed. But as far as having a dedicated provenance researcher, that's something that's really just kind of come into the field in the last decade or so. I was one of the first handful of them here in the U.S. They're much more prevalent in European museums. But I was really privileged to be able to take on this role here at the Nelson-Atkins in 2015.
So is there an educational path for somebody in provenance? If it's a newer field, you probably didn't have classes concerning provenance, correct?
That's true. I didn't. Provenance as a career field didn't really exist when I was in graduate school. Even today, there's still no dedicated university program that teaches only provenance, as far as I'm aware, in the U.S. But I knew that I wanted to work in museums. I was interested in history, and
now your dad was a history buff.
He is.
Did you get that from him? History?
I probably did. He's a huge history buff. Mm-hmm. He reads a lot of historical nonfiction. And when I was growing up, we took family trips and vacations to historical sites. And understanding, especially American history, was always a huge part of just my upbringing. So it probably is where I get a lot of my interest in the history side of things.
And so you were studying history, but also art.
Yes, I did an undergraduate degree in history and a master's in art history, which has really been a great introduction to my work today, because it's kind of, instead of art history, it's kind of the history of the art, right?
Mm-hmm,
But you know, if I was to put together a university program to teach provenance today, it would probably include not just history and not just art history, but also language studies, education in the politics and world cultures, from around the world, as well as library skills, because so much of what I do is in our libraries.
Finding the information, that's what you're trying to do.
Yes, exactly.
Each day is probably very different for you. If there is a typical day, is there such a thing as a typical day? What do you do when you come into work, I guess is what I'm asking.
That's a great question. Usually the first thing I do when I get into work is try to order my thoughts and make a list of things I want to accomplish that day, because it can be a little overwhelming. I usually am researching many objects all at once, and I have to be uber organized to keep it all straight. And I fail at that a lot, but I try to do my best and be organized with my work. But I might be researching an object in our European collection at the same time I'm researching something in decorative arts or maybe Chinese art. Maybe I'm researching a new acquisition that's coming in, and so there's more of a time consideration in that instance. So I'm always trying to keep up with the research that I'm doing and where I've left off and where I need to go next. But we also get a lot of inquiries about the history of our collection, and so I respond to those a lot too. And those come to me a lot through email or just through colleagues who have questions about the history of our objects.
How do you prioritize? I mean, you've got thousands of objects that you could be looking at in any particular day. How do you figure that out?
Well, new acquisitions usually get the first slot just because there is a time consideration, because we always want to know everything we can about the history of an object before we acquire it. After that, it usually is special projects that I might be working on with our curators. There's always something long-term that's going on in the background. So I'm working on a project to learn more about the World War II history of our decorative arts right now. So we're working on that, as well as our Chinese collection. So there's always something bubbling, and you're right, every day is something completely different.
Which is fun.
It's a lot of fun. I really enjoy it.
Do you travel a lot?
I travel usually several times a year, which is great. I don't do a lot of sightseeing during these trips. People always ask me, did you see this and that? And no, I didn't see any of that because I had my head stuck in the records in an archive. But you know what? I wouldn't change a thing, because it's really getting into those hidden archives and those amazing libraries around the world that is what really just makes me appreciate the value of what we're doing here at the Nelson-Atkins and understanding the history of these collections. And I usually go to archives or libraries here in the U.S. a couple of times each year, and sometimes in Europe, just because that's where the information is. That's where the records are that we need to do some searching in. And it's been wonderful in the last few years, the increase in digitization that has made so much more accessible for us.
How does that help you?
Well, it means that we can see a lot of records that we need to look at without physically having to go to a particular place in some instances. And so that saves us money for travel and for that sort of thing. But in the broad scheme of things, just a very, very, very small amount of archival documentation has been digitized. So there's still a great need to have to go there and dig into the records ourselves. But there's still also a value to doing that, because once we're in those records, we see the greater context of what it is we're researching. And we can shift on the fly if we need to. So if I find a particular piece of information that may make me realize, oh, I need to also see X file, or I need to see this box, then I can make that transition if I'm there in person. Plus, meeting people who do provenance research, who are interested in the history of collections and are working on learning more about these histories, having that connection, having that network is crucial, is really vital to this work, because it is so broad and we're trying to cover so many bases at one time that none of us can know everything. And so by making those connections with other researchers, we can collaborate and help each other find more information and further all of our work down the road.
You must speak several languages. I'm imagining you in Italy looking through records. They're not going to be in English, probably.
No, not usually. I don't speak many languages. I do speak German, but it's really the reading of the languages that's more important than the speaking of them.
So you are able to read different languages.
I am, but at the same time, new technologies in language translation have been a huge help in the past few years. So that's taken a lot of the pressure off of us Provenance
Google Translate
researchers.
is your best friend.
Google Translate does help a lot. I do have to admit that. But at the same time, it is very helpful to be able to read the languages that we're working in the most because I can move more quickly that way. So if I'm, for example, in a German archive, it just is easier to move more quickly through the documentation if I can read it myself and I don't have to wait for some kind of translation.
Some years ago, you mounted an exhibition here at the Nelson-Atkins called Discriminating Thieves. Tell us about that. I loved that exhibition.
Yeah, that was in 2019. And it was really a small show. It just brought together 4 objects in our permanent collection that have had a history of having been affected by the art looting that took place underneath the Nazi regime in Germany between 1933 and 1945. So during the Nazi regime, Hitler and his staff looted or stole tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of works of art from private collectors in the countries in which the Germans were occupiers, mostly from Jewish collectors. And because of the scale of this event, researching what we call the Nazi era history of our objects is really of paramount importance to us. So it really is one of our priorities. We always want to make sure that anything in our collection that could have changed hands during that period or might have been in continental Europe during that period, we want to make sure we know the circumstances of that provenance to make sure that nothing we have was affected by that and not returned after the war. And so the Discriminating Thieves exhibition, we were able to show 3 objects in our collection that had actually been looted under the Nazi regime. Thankfully, our research showed us that all of them had been recovered after the war and returned to their former owners. So we were able to tell the complete story of that history of these objects. And we did so using the objects themselves, of course, but also we had a digital interactive in the gallery that showed the archival records that we used to document this. So it was a great opportunity to teach our visitors about the importance of provenance research, but specifically how this kind of research can tell the stories of people who have been affected by these terrible moments in history. And then we also had an object that had been removed from a German museum under the degenerate art action that took place under the Nazis as well. And that was Hitler's move to rid Germany of the kind of art that he didn't like. So he was very much a proponent of classical, Renaissance, Baroque, old masters, 19th century German landscape, more traditional, I guess you might say, art. Whereas, of course, the really incredible art styles of that period of the 1930s in Germany were just so unbelievably fresh and new and would go on to become some of the most important artistic styles in the history of art: German expressionism, surrealism, abstraction. Hitler thought that these modern styles were degenerating or immoral, and that the German people shouldn't they shouldn't look at them, they shouldn't collect them. And so he removed these examples from the German museums and dispersed them outside of Germany. So we included in Discriminating Thieves one painting from our collection that has that history as well. So we were able to tell both sides of the story when it comes to art underneath the Nazi regime.
The Monuments Men had a lot to do with getting some of that art back. Isn't that correct?
They did, yes. So the Monuments Men were a group of 350 men and women who were working with the Allied forces to protect cultural heritage in war areas, as well as to recover art that had been stolen under the Nazi regime. And so at the end of the war, they found a lot of the looted art in storage repositories all around Europe, were able to work to return it to its previous owners.
And it was a movie with George Clooney.
It was a movie with George Clooney, Matt Damon, a lot of really big names. The movie itself was really just loosely based in truth, but I think like a lot of Hollywood movies, real life is even more exciting than the film.
Well, and we had some monuments men who worked here at the museum.
We did. We have 6 out of the 350 who were affiliated with the Nelson-Atkins at some point in their lives. Paul Gardner was our first director, and he worked as a monuments man in Italy. And Lawrence Sickman was our first curator of Asian art, and he worked as a monuments man in Asia. And it's in the Asian theater is really not as well understood today, so there's still a lot for us to learn about his time there.
Has there ever been a moment that just totally blew your mind when you're working? There are probably many of those moments, but can you share a couple of stories with us?
I think because we're talking about the Nazi era provenance research that we do, I think oftentimes when I think back to the first time I discovered something in our collection had that history, that was really definitely a mind-blowing moment for me.
And you weren't looking for that, probably.
I was not looking. I was just flipping through a book and about Nazi art looting, and I came across a photograph of one of our paintings. And it was surprising to me and scary, but at the same time,
I would think exciting.
Well, exciting in that, oh my gosh, like we have a lot of work to do.
Right. That's true. That's true.
But you know, we've worked really hard to research all of our collection to the fullest extent. And of course, we were able to research that particular painting and discover that we have a great provenance. It was returned to the family after the war, and there's no issues with it today, but it's so great that we were able to document that history, and now we can tell the stories of the people who were involved in that object's history.
Augustus the Strong, is that the painting you're talking about?
That's right. It's by Nicolas Largelière. It's on our French paintings collection.
It's a huge painting.
It's a very large painting. And at the end of the war, it was stored in a salt mine in Austria, and that's where the monuments men found it in May of 1945.
Other surprises that you've come across when you're researching?
Gosh, it's hard to narrow it down because every day is a surprise. And I often think about Alice in Wonderland because I follow the rabbit hole so frequently every day, something new. Oh gosh, I want to know more about this. So I'm going to research this today. And but now I found this and I want to turn that direction. Sometimes it's hard to keep myself focused on where I want to go.
That could be the title of your book, Down the Rabbit Hole.
Down the rabbit hole. Absolutely.
Join me.
Join me down the rabbit hole. But, I think when I was first getting into provenance research, one of the things that surprised me was how oftentimes when I would come across the existing provenance of an object that included a woman collector, oftentimes those women were identified as Mrs. George Smith, Mrs. Bob Jones.
Oh, so how would you know who that woman was?
Yes. Who were these women? What was their first name? And so ever since then, I've tried to, as much as I could, learn more about the women who were included in the provenance of our collection. And it's been a very rewarding part of my research is to learn more about these women because they were so influential in the history of our collection and the history of the museum as well.
So you're not looking just at art records, you're looking at birth records, death records to try to track people down through any manner that you can find.
Absolutely. Genealogy, all of that. It's everywhere we can find information is where we go.
Is that what keeps you coming back every day?
It is. But honestly, I think what keeps me coming back the most is the incredible staff that I get to work with here every day. Provenance research is very much a group effort. I'm not the only one doing this research. All of our curators are doing it, our curatorial staff. We have help from registration, conservation, many many, many divisions in the museum work towards knowing more about the history of our collection. And because they are such wonderful collaborators and wonderful colleagues, I think that's my favorite part about coming to the museum every day.
You're doing such important work. We are really glad you keep coming back.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
Thank you, MacKenzie. And thank you for joining us. You've been listening to Art Bites, a podcast from the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art. I'm Kathleen Layton, and we'll see you next time.